Lou just said you don't have to be kind in your introduction of Joseph. First of all, you're going to see me after Joseph, but it won't be me. I will be appearing as J.R.R. Tolkien, presenting Tolkien's lecture on fairy stories, or an abbreviated version of it. And I have the tweed coat and a vest and a different tie backstage, so to speak. So that's why I don't have a jacket on, because I don't want to be Tolkien on myself right now. But I do play Tolkien on TV. I am not J.R.R. Tolkien. Joseph is selling this at his table, along with many of his books. EWTN has done a series of specials on the Catholic elements in Tolkien's writings, and I have had the honor to play Tolkien on TV in the specials hosted by Joseph Pearce. This is the best one, the one that Joseph is selling. Elves, Hobbits, and Men, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Joseph hosts it, I play Tolkien, and they have wonderful artwork by the late Jeff Murray is in this, and some music. It's really an excellent production, one of the best things EWTN has done. And the other thing I'm supposed to plug, although I don't know why, I bought this apron. It's a quote St. Teresa of Avila. We have these fly-by-night distributists who have set up in the cafeteria, so that if you're hungry or thirsty, you've got to be right by their table. And they're like hawking this stuff, and I'm certain they have no license, because they're distributists, not capitalists, so they do it their own way. Now, as for Joseph Pearce, when you call him, he answers his phone and he says, "Joseph Pearce." That's how he answers his phone. And I think that's really cool. So now, when people call me, I say, "Joseph Pearce." And we kind of take it from there. Joseph is one of the most profound speakers and thinkers and writers on literature and the faith and philosophy after he's had about 8 drinks. Unfortunately, this morning he's completely sober. That won't last long, but you're going to have to sit through it. And even though you may not understand what he's saying, the accent is charming. And the funny thing about it is, many people don't know this, I know him quite well. Joseph Pearce was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. His entire biography and accent is an affectation. And the irony is, he thought that he would sound more sophisticated with an English accent. So, but he talks, it's kind of an East London Cockney. So it's a lower class English accent, but Americans are so stupid. And we listen to Joseph Pearce and we're thinking, whoa, this man's a genius. He's speaking the King's English. So at any rate, so you'll be treated to that. The other thing about Joseph Pearce is women flock to him. It's the accent, I'm sure that is. The other thing is, I think he's having an affair with my wife. And the reason I say that is they've just really hit it off. And so we were together in Nashville last weekend for a conference in Nashville, and we were all staying at the same hotel. Dale and Joseph, my wife and I, she was with me last week, and we got home late from one of the evenings, and there's Joseph at the front desk, and he turns to us and he says, "I waited for you." And I said, "Thank you, Joseph." And he says, "I wasn't talking to you." So, my wife is not with me on this trip. This was the voicemail she left me last night.
"Hey, it's me. I wanted to call and tell Joseph good night. How come you just answered your phone?" "All right, well, I just wanted to call and tell Joseph good night."
Yeah, there you go. So you can imagine how I feel. And I suppose that's really about all I can say. Oh, except for one other thing. Just now in the hallway, I said, "Joseph, it's wonderful to see people who are so moved by Chesterton. Because those of us who live and breathe Chesterton, we sometimes forget that the real effect he's had. I mean, he's had a profound effect on my life, on Dale's, on Joseph's. He's responsible in many ways for our conversions. But we forget that ordinary people like you are moved by him. Socrates says that oratory is a form of flattery, so ordinary people like you. I said, Joseph, so many people here love Chesterton. They're moved by Chesterton. He's touched them. He's changed them. And I said, all it takes, Joseph, is two things: good writing and personal sanctity. If you have holiness and you're a good writer, you can change the world. And Joseph said, well, I got one of those too. And then he said, I'm working on being a better writer. All right, so I'm gonna bring him up. Seriously, as a comic, in all seriousness, Joseph Pearce is a man. He actually is a man of fairly astonishing personal sanctity. Although you can't necessarily tell because he's filled with so much joy. But I think joy is a sign of that. And he was one of the sweetest human beings that I know. And I'm honored to be his friend and delighted to know him and work with him. Ladies and gentlemen, Joseph Pearce.
Thank you, Kevin. That was all going very well, so you got all sort of gushy and sentimental at the end. I mean, I'm much more comfortable when you insult me, actually. The good news, by the way, is that I got up this morning at 5 o'clock, and I've been drinking Kentucky bourbon since then. So this is going to be a great talk. No, actually, it's going to be somewhat soap talk in more ways than one, because I'm speaking on... I'll take this off, I think. That's not all I'm going to take off, so you might want to leave now. Chesterton casts a spell on Tolkien and Lewis, and that's going to be my topic. I'm going to spend most of it actually going through chunks of the Ethics of Elfland, showing how that influenced Tolkien particularly, but also Lewis. But the word spell, as Tolkien tells us in his lecture on fairy stories that he'll be giving for us later, that the word spell means to actually have power over someone or something. It's also very interesting that we use the word spell about spelling words. Right? You spell a word. And again, from the same old English, because there's a power in words. So we're all here because we love G.K. Chesterton, and yes, he was a very holy man, but it's the power of his words that he conveys. And of course, Tolkien and Lewis, the power of their words. And Chesterton was the most influential person. That's very good, by the way. I'm going to put my you should patent that or something. There's a clock there counting down how much time I've got. I don't know what happens if it gets to the end. Before I finish. It starts spreading with only 2 minutes left. But at the moment, I've got 43 minutes. I'm relaxed at the moment. I feel like James Bond, watching it go down, explode or something at 0. But under Grace, I always say this, under Grace, Chesterton was the most important influence upon my conversion. And when I was researching my book on literary converts, it did surprise me. I mean, in hindsight, I don't know why it did so much, but I was very surprised and pleasantly surprised at how many other people, these great literary converts, were influenced, at least in part, on their conversion on the writing of G.K. Chesterton. And of course, two great converts were Tolkien. As I said, Tolkien's not a convert, he's a cradle convert, his mother's a convert. But two of these great writers of the 20th century, Tolkien and Lewis, were hugely influenced by G.K. Chesterton. That's what I want to talk about today. Tolkien was born in 1892. Chesterton was first published in 1900, so when Tolkien was 8 years old. His mother was received into the Catholic Church in 1900. So the same year that Chesterton was first published, his mother becomes a Catholic and has both her sons received into the church at the same time and baptized. I sometimes call Tolkien a cradle convert, because he's 8 years old. So from the age of 8, when Chesterton was first published, right up to the First World War, when Tolkien goes off to fight in what he calls the animal horror of the Battle of the Somme. So that 14-year period from Tolkien's basically 8 to when he's 22, these very, very formative years. Tolkien would have, we know, read a great deal of Chesterton, knew Chesterton's works very well. And of course, right in the middle of that period, in 1908, was when Orthodoxy was published. And what is fascinating is the influence of Chesterton in general, and perhaps this particular chapter, The Ethics of Elfland in particular, on Tolkien's philosophy of myth. So we could almost say that if it wasn't for Chesterton, there might not be The Lord of the Rings. Now, Lewis, on the other hand, was an atheist, and during World War I, when he first read Chesterton, he was in the British Army, and although he was an atheist, he said he couldn't help just loving G.K. Chesterton, loved his sense of humour, loved his writing style, and he said that Chesterton had more common sense than all the moderns put together, except, of course, his Christianity. But he continued to read Chesterton. It's a book of essays, the first thing he read. Unfortunately, he never told us which book of essays. But he continued to read, and in 1927, Lewis, by this time, is a professor at Oxford, still an atheist, and he reads The Everlasting Man. And reading Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, he said, I saw the Christian outline of history laid out before me for the first time in a way that made sense. And so these were two major milestones on Lewis's conversion to Christianity. But reading Chesterton, discovering Chesterton in the trenches of World War I, and then reading The Everlasting Man in 1927 when he would have been 31 years old. No, 29 years old. So Chesterton's influence on both Tolkien and Lewis. Now, last weekend, actually seen an awful lot of Kevin and Dal lately, because last weekend I invited both of them to speak at our inaugural Tolkien and Lewis celebration at Aquinas College in Nashville. That was actually September 19th, last Saturday, was the anniversary of the famous long night talk, to use Lewis's phrase, between Tolkien and Lewis on the philosophy of myth. And it went on, through the night in Lewis's rooms and what have you at Magdalen College. And it began when Lewis said, "But myths are lies, and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver." In other words, we like myths, we like stories because they're beautiful. But they don't tell us the truth. And because they don't tell us the truth, ultimately they have no value. And Tolkien responded, no, they are not lies. And the rest of the conversation was basically about how the greatest truths are told in stories. And the very important thing you have to understand here is when Tolkien and Lewis use the word myth, it doesn't mean lie. Because one modern usage of the word myth is a lie or an untruth, something which is not true. Tolkien and Lewis never use the word myth in that way. They use it from the Greek mythos. It's a story. And that God himself tells us the most important, shows us, teaches us the most important lessons in stories. So Jesus Christ, with his parables, and of course the story, as the Hollywood movie called it, the greatest story ever told, was the life, the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. His life story is the most powerful story ever told. So God shows us himself in a story. So myth and truth go hand in hand. And what I'd like to show is how that long night talk has such a profound influence on Lewis that within a couple of weeks he was writing to a friend, said, I've definitely started believing in the Christian God. And the long night talk with Tolkien had a great deal to do with it. So in other words, it was this philosophy of myth, this philosophy of story, which was the final milestone on Lewis's conversion. So I want to talk about this now. The rest of the talk, I want to basically go through. One other thing I just want to say, I think I may have mentioned this last year. Probably when you come back somewhere every year, you don't know what you may have heard lots of stuff already. But I think last year I mentioned about, I don't know what I spoke on last year, but I hope you don't, and that'd be great, sort of like. But about the Lord of the Rings being one of the top 10 best-selling books of all time. Did I mention that last year? I did. Second or third best-selling book of all time. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is also in the top 10 best-selling books of all time. So these two men, Tolkien and Lewis, have had a profound and huge impact on our culture, beneficial impact. And what I want to show here is how, if it wasn't, Tolkien said of his relationship with Lewis, that if it wasn't for, Lewis was not an influence on me in the way that word is usually understood. But he said, but Lewis was a great encourager. And if it wasn't for Lewis's encouragement, I would never have finished The Lord of the Rings. So we can say, in all honesty, the power of their friendship, that if it wasn't for Lewis's friendship with Tolkien, we would not have The Lord of the Rings. Which is something we should ponder. But also, as this long night talk shows, that if Lewis had not befriended Tolkien and came to understand Tolkien's philosophy of myth, we would not have had The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. So we have Tolkien to thank for Narnia, and we have Lewis to thank for Middle-earth, and it's a very profound thought to take with us. But what I want to show in the remainder of my talk is how, without G.K. Chesterton, he may have had neither of them. He may have had neither Narnia or Middle-earth, because of the influence that Chesterton had on Tolkien and Lewis, and on their development, their understanding of the philosophy of myth, the philosophy of story. So I'm going to go through here, parts of the Ethics of Elfland, in chunks, and talk about them, and occasionally pick up Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, his lecture on fairy stories, and look at how you can see the connection, okay? The Ethics of Elfland was published in chapter 4 of Orthodoxy back in 1908. Tolkien gives his lecture on fairy stories in 1939. So 20. I teach literature, I can't do math. 31 years later, is that right? It must be 31 years later, right. So I'm going to go through some of this. Lou mentioned about tradition. This had a very, very profound impact upon me, this idea, but also we'll see how important it is to Tolkien. But there is one thing that I have never from my youth been able to understand. I've never been able to understand where people got the idea that democracy was in some way opposed to tradition. It is obvious that tradition is only democracy extended through time. It is quite easy to see why a legend is treated, and ought to be treated, more respectfully than a book of history. The legend is generally made by the majority of people in the village who are sane. The book is generally written by the one man in the village who is mad. Tradition may be defined as an extension of the franchise. Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. I, at any rate, cannot separate the two ideas of democracy and tradition. It seems evident to me that they are the same idea. Can I just ask you, how many people here have read The Lord of the Rings? Okay, many of you, good. Well, one thing, if you having heard that quote from Chesterton in The Ethics of Elfland, one of the most powerful ingredients of The Lord of the Rings is the presence of the past in the story. The depth of that story is rooted, literally, in tradition. And without that tradition and the fact that all the characters living in the present are carrying with them the wealth of that inherited tradition they've got from their ancestors, without that, the Lord of the Rings would be a shallow and superficial thing. So what we do see in the Lord of the Rings, I think, is the incarnation of this acceptance of the idea that tradition is democracy extended through time, giving votes to our ancestors. All right. Further on, the same chapter. The things I believe most then, this is Chesterton from his own childhood. The things I believe most then, the things I believe most now, are the things called fairy tales. They seem to me to be the entirely reasonable things. Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. It is not earth that judges heaven, but heaven that judges earth. So for me at least, it was not earth that criticised Elfland, but Elfland that criticised the earth. Again, this is a profound idea that the morality in fairy stories serve as a judgment upon the world in which we live. Or as Tolkien was saying in his essay on fairy stories, they hold up a mirror to man. They show us ourselves. So here we see, basically, the key thing is the should judges the is. Now, can you look at our own lives? Like, we're miserable sinners, or at least you are. I'm good at this act if you think, Kenny. We're miserable sinners. And we know what our faults are, what our flaws are, the things that make us fall. But we don't judge ourselves by those weaknesses. We judge ourselves to the perfection we're meant to aspire towards, which is Christ. And of course, we know we're never going to be as good as Jesus Christ. But the purpose of life is to be as close to being as good as Jesus Christ as we can. So we don't judge ourselves by the fact that we're in the gutter. We judge ourselves by the fact that we're called to lift ourselves up towards the stars. The should judges the is. And again, I want to now go to Tolkien on this. On fairy stories. Fairy stories were plainly not primarily concerned with possibility, but with desirability. It's basically saying the same thing. Fairy stories are about the way things should be, the way we desire them to be, not necessarily the way they are, because the should judges the is. Not is, but should. And also, we're not talking about the everlasting man here, but I know that I have said this at previous conferences here, talking about chronological snobbery and what Chesterton has to say about the Stone Age man. So some of you would have heard that. But I'll repeat it, just to make sure we get the context of what Tolkien's saying here. In the everlasting man, Chesterton takes the task chronological snobbery, and I think chronological snobbery was a phrase coined by Lewis. I'm fairly sure that's the case. But basically, obviously, Lewis gets it from Chesterton. He says, after reading The Everlasting Man, I saw the Christian outline of history laid out before me for the first time in a way that made sense. Well, one of the things Chesterton does that in that book, at the beginning of the book, The Man in the Cave, it says that we presume that our ancestors are inferior to us merely because they're in the past. In other words, we're better than they are because we're now, and they were then. Our ancestors were ignorant. And he looks at the caveman, and he says, when we're told that cavemen are ape men, they're like intelligent apes, and they dragged their women around by their hair, and when they got tired of their wife, they killed her, hit her over the head with a club, and found a new one. But he says, well, let's look at the evidence. Let's be radical about this and look at the evidence. Let's do something really radical. Let's take a look in the cave. And when you go in the cave, you don't find, says Chesterton, a neat pile of female human skulls all neatly cracked like eggs. You don't find that. When you go into the cave, you find art. You find art on the walls. The one thing that unites our ancient ancestors with ourselves, the desire to create in the manner in which we are created. As Tolkien says, sub-create. This is Tolkien, same sort of thing. So he's quoting Andrew Lang from his Green Fairy book, and again in this chapter, The Ethics of Elfland, Chesterton also refers to Andrew Lang. So as Andrew Lang says, their taste remains like the taste of their naked ancestors. Talk about children, okay? Their taste remains like the taste of their naked ancestors, thousands of years ago. And they seem to like fairy tales better than history, poetry, geography, or arithmetic. That's the end of the quote. This is what Tolkien says. But do we really know much about these naked ancestors, except that they were certainly not naked? Our fairy stories, however old, contain elements in them. Our fairy stories, however old certain elements in them may be, are certainly not the same as theirs. Yet if it is assumed that we have fairy stories because they did, then probably we have history, geography, poetry, and arithmetic because they like these things too, as far as they could get them. And insofar as they had yet separated the many branches of their general interest in everything. So again, you see that Tolkien doing the same thing. That when you look back at our naked ancestors, the first sheep, you'll know they're not naked. And yes, they like stories, but they probably also like history, tradition. I mean, I think the two things are also connected. Right? Stories about your grandfather being passed down to your own children. Right? It's history. But it's all history, it's also legend, it's also story. So let's move on through the Ethics of Elfland a bit further. Lou, this is a point of interest. Mine's only 12 pages long. But then I printed it from the internet, so that might have something to do with it. And one of the most profound things Chesterton never said, and of course he said many, many profound things. Every man has forgotten who he is. I've been trying to forget the fact I was born in Omaha, Nebraska, Kevin, you brought it up, but there you are. Every man has forgotten who he is. One may understand the cosmos, but never the ego. The self is more distant than any star. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, but thou shalt not know thyself. We are all under the same mental calamity. We have all forgotten our names. We have all forgotten what we really are. All that we call common sense and rationality and practicality and positivism only means that for certain dead levels of our life, we forget that we have forgotten. All that we call spirit and art and ecstasy only means that for one awful instant we remember that we forget. Profound. The mystery of the self, which is more distant than any star. You will love the Lord thy God, but you will not know yourself. And as Tolkien says in On Fairy Stories, and as Chesterton says in this chapter from Orthodoxy, that one of the purposes of fairy stories is to show us ourselves. The sunny country of common sense, or as Tolkien says, it's a mirror to man. Shows us ourselves. And what they do, they show us that we are anthropos, as the Greeks say, he who looks up, he who's not a slave to instinct. That the animal grazes, man gazes. That's the difference. And fairy stories show us that. And also fairy stories show us, because there are so many of them, including Tolkien's own fairy stories, of course, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, show us that we are also not Homo sapiens, we are Homo viator. We're man on a journey. And that our lives are a journey. They're a quest, they're an adventure. And on that adventure we're going to face many dragons, demons, tempters, and we're going to fall into temptation, into sin. It's a quest. And the goal is to get to heaven. And it's the only purpose of life. And there is no other purpose to life. And if at the end of your life story you haven't achieved the quest, you failed in the only thing you were meant to succeed in. So again, you can look inside yourself as far as you like, and you're never going to discover yourself. But you can look at a fairy story and see an image of yourself as anthropos or as Homo viator, and come to understand the meaning of life. So again, more from Chesterton here. But though, like the man without memory in the novel, we walk the streets with a sort of half-witted admiration, still it is admiration. It is admiration in English and not only admiration in Latin. The one that has a positive element of praise. Because admiration, mirrors, some of my Latin's not that good, but this just basically means wonder. Okay, but admiration doesn't just mean wonder, it also means to admire someone, to actually, in some sense, praise them. An element of prayer or praise. So there's admiration in English, not only admiration in Latin. The wonder has a positive element of praise. And the strongest emotion was that life was as precious as it was puzzling. It was an ecstasy because it was an adventure. It was an adventure because it was an opportunity. The goodness of the fairy tale was not affected by the fact that there might be more dragons than princesses. It was good to be in a fairy tale. And he's talking about more dragons than princesses because he's talking here in the context of the two errors of pessimism and optimism. Right? The pessimist says, well, there are more dragons than princesses. The optimist says there are more princesses than dragons. And he's saying it doesn't matter. Right? Because the important thing is the journey and achieving the quest. The test of all happiness, and this is absolutely key. If you remember these few words of Chesterton, you won't go far wrong in your life. The test of all happiness is gratitude. And I felt grateful, though I hardly knew to whom. Children are grateful when Santa Claus puts in their stockings gifts of toys or sweets. Could I not be grateful to Santa Claus when he put in my stockings the gift of two miraculous legs? We thank people for birthday presents of slippers and cigars. But I thank no one for the birthday present of birth. And this inextricable connection between gratitude and humility is the actual answer to everything. Because pride leads to ingratitude. To fail to see and appreciate and be thankful for the many blessings, the many miracles that our very lives are. Let me just go, again, parallel from Tolkien on fairy stories. Because basically gratitude opens the eyes of wonder. And that's one thing, of course, about Chesterton. And the whole point he's trying to get across in this chapter is that we have to open our eyes to the wonder of the cosmos. And the fairy stories are merely a means of helping us to open our eyes so that we can see the miracle that is the life we're living more clearly. So, Tolkien says that one of the functions, one of the purposes of fairy stories is what he calls recovery. So recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining, and he hyphenates that, to make sure we're paying attention. Regaining is a regaining of a clear view, I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need in any case to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness, of familiarity, from possessiveness. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or in a bad sense familiar, are the things that we have appropriated, legally or mentally. We say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter, or their colour, or their shape. And we laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring ceased to look at them. Of course, fairy stories are not the only means of recovery or prophylactic against loss. Humility is enough. And there is, especially for the humble, Morifolk, or Chestertonian fantasy. Morifolk is a fantastic word, but it could be seen written up in every town in this land. It is coffee room, viewed from the inside through a glass door, as it was seen by Dickens on a dark London day, and it was used by Chesterton to denote the queerness of things that had become trite when they are seen suddenly from a new angle. So you see here, talking directly, referring to Chesterton, the idea that we have to be astonished by the everyday life that we're living. I would even say that every time we walk by a tree, every time we walk past a tree and fail to see it, it's a sin. Because we are blinded from the beauty of creation. Every leaf on that tree is unique, made by God, a gift to be seen and contemplated. This need for recovery that both Tolkien and Chesterton say is one of the great strengths of fairy stories. Anyone can see it who will simply read Grimm's fairy tales or the fine collections of Mr. Andrew Lang. For the pleasure of pedantry, I will call it the doctrine of conditional joy. This is Chesterton again, obviously. Touchstone talked of much virtue in an if. According to Elfland ethics, all virtue is an if. The note of the fairy utterance always says, "You may live in a palace of gold and sapphire, if you do not say the word cow." Or you may live happily with the king's daughter, if you do not show her an onion. The vision always hangs upon a veto. All the dizzy and colossal things conceded depend upon one small thing withheld. All the wild and whirling things that are let loose depend upon one thing that is forbidden. Now, I'm not making a comment about that at the moment. I'm just going to read Tolkien saying basically the same thing. He talks about the great mythical significance of prohibition. Thou shalt not, or else thou shalt depart, beggared into endless regret. The locked door stands as an eternal temptation. The locked door stands as an eternal temptation. Now, fairy stories here, this if you don't show the princess an onion, might sound silly because Chesterton is being whimsical. But the if is an essential part of reality. And why? Because we have been given the gift of freedom, which means we are able to choose. So, what God does, He shows us a locked door, the tree in the garden, shows us a locked door, but then He gives us the key. Sounds almost sadistic. Don't open that door, but here's the key. And the point is, of course, the reason we're given the key is the key is freedom. We are no longer slaves to instinct. We're not like the beasts of the field. We can choose to be like God. We can choose to be virtuous. We can choose our way to heaven by His grace, cooperating with it, with our will. It's a great gift, this key. All we have to do is not use it. And of course, we do use it. So you see it obviously in the apple in the garden, the locked door, Pandora's box. Don't open the box. So we open the box and pay the consequences. Or the ring. Here's a ring, don't wear it. And the ring's very powerful and it's sort of almost demanding to be worn. So carrying the ring is like carrying the cross, it's resisting the temptation, choosing correctly. So you see here how Tolkien and Chesterton were one. Lewis, by the way, of course, a magician's nephew, if you remember. In the garden, the fruit there is beautiful, and it contains your heart's desire when you eat it. But you have to be invited to eat it. If you eat it in defiance, even though you haven't been invited, it will bring you your heart's desire, and you'll despair. You'll get what you want, and you'll hate it. Because you're choosing pride. You're choosing to make yourself God. Living with yourself alone as God for eternity is to make a hell for yourself. So you see how Chesterton, Tolkien and Lewis are all doing the same sort of thing. So Chesterton here. A box is opened and all evils fly out. A word is forgotten and cities perish. A lamp is lit and love flies away. A flower is plucked, and human lives are forfeited. An apple is eaten, and the hope of God is gone. Such, it seemed, was the joy of man, either in Elfland or on earth. The happiness depended on not doing something which you could at any moment do, and which very often it was not obvious why you should not do. And again, back to gratitude, but the reverse side of the coin. This is Chesterton basically talking about the decadent movement of the previous decade. So obviously this has been written in the first decade of the 20th century. The English decadence reached its height in the last decade of the 19th century. So men, I felt, might fast 40 days for the sake of hearing a blackbird sing. Men might go through fire to find a cowslip. Yet these lovers of beauty could not even keep sober for the blackbird. Oscar Wilde said that sunsets were not valued because we could not pay for sunsets. But Oscar Wilde was wrong. We can pay for sunsets. We can pay for them by not being Oscar Wilde. Which is a little bit unfair on poor Oscar Wilde. As I said, Lord Darlington in Lady Windermere's fan describes a cynic as one knows the value of it, the price of everything and the value of nothing. And and also it was Wilde who said we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. Just maybe a little bit unfair on poor Oscar there. But the point, of course, is that the decadence. They spoke, and I prefer maybe rather than using Wilde as a scapegoat or as an example there, to go back to people maybe like Shelley. or Bible, these aesthetes of the beginning of the 19th century, who talked much about beauty and indeed wrote some of the most beautiful poetry in the English language, and yet would not stay sober for the blackbird. I mean, they should really be on their knees to the blackbird, not to worship the blackbird, but to worship the work of art that blackbird is. Which is, of course, the handiwork of God himself. And again, in Lewis, I want to sort of insert some Lewis in here, because it's mostly about Tolkien and Chesterton. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, it's always winter, but never Christmas. Now, we could, as literary critics, complain, well, how on earth can there be Christmas in Narnia? Right? There is no Christ. But I think we probably should give Lewis a bit of literary license here, because he's really writing for 7-year-olds. And I really need to bear that in mind. And for a 7-year-old, of course, that really brings it home. Because the most wonderful day of the year is Christmas morning. It really encapsulates the nearest the 7-year-olds are going to get to understanding heaven, ecstasy, Christmas morning. Always winter and never Christmas? Think about that. Now you have to be like a 7-year-old to understand, which is good. We should be like 7-year-olds. But then, of course, the purpose of that is, of course, when Aslan comes, spring arrives. And what you're seeing, cowslips, flowers. And the way that Lewis describes that, these people have not seen flowers, ever. Because it's always been winter. And now they're seeing flowers for the first time. And it wakes them up from their deep winter, but it's meant to wake us up also. To go out and look at a flower, rather than just walk past it next time. Because otherwise, if it's always winter in our hearts, we don't see the flowers either. We need to have the spirit of Christmas to wake us up. 4 minutes to the explosion. It's all the time to get out of here. I'll give you a 2-minute warning, okay? And I get towards the end of it now. This is Chesterton again from the Ethics of Elfland. This world of ours has some purpose. And if there is a purpose, there is a person. I'd always felt life first as a story. And if there is a story, there is a storyteller. Profound philosophy, put very simply, great gift of G.K. Chesterton. He talks about modern thought, love to talk about expansion and largeness. Herbert Spencer popularized this contemptible notion that the size of the solar system ought to overawe the spiritual dogma of man. Why should a man surrender his dignity to the solar system any more than to a whale? If mere size proves that man is not the image of God, then a whale may be the image of God. It is quite futile to argue that man is small compared to the cosmos. Man was always small compared to the nearest tree. And of course, I say to my students, I've taught this a few times, I said to my students, in what way is everybody in this room larger than the cosmos? In what way is everybody in this room larger than the sun? And it's because you can see the sun, you can think about the sun, you can talk about the sun, you can write poetry about the sun, you can measure how far the sun is from the earth. The sun can't do any of those things, it's an inanimate object. It's a big inanimate object, but it's an inanimate object. It has a lower IQ than an ant. The materialist, like the madman, is in prison. In the prison of one thought. These people seem to think it's singularly inspiring to keep on saying that the prison was very large. It was like telling a prisoner in Reading jail that he would be glad to hear that the jail now covered half the county. The warder would have nothing to show the man except more and more long corridors of stone lit by ghastly lights and empty of all that is human. So these expanders of the universe had nothing to show us except more and more infinite corridors of space lit by ghastly suns and empty of all that is divine. Now, I'm almost done here. Look at Tolkien, fairy stories. The same thing. It's so obvious to me that this idea is plucked directly from the Ethics of Elfland. One of the other purposes of fairy stories, he says, is escape. To escape. And this escapism is hated by so-called realists. And he says, why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The critics are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so, a party spokesman might have labelled departure from the misery of the Führers or any other like, and even criticism of it as treachery. In other words, materialists hate fairy stories because it's an escape from reality. But their reality is a prison. Materialism is a prison. There's nothing but three dimensions. In actual fact, we are not made for the prison. We're made to escape from the prison. We're meant to think about things other than mere matter. And that says matter doesn't matter. Alright, just to finish off, the final words of Chesterton, and we'll give the final words to them. Same thing, by the way, in the Silver Chair, if you remember, the Chronicles of Narnia, when the witch is trying to convince them there is no Narnia, and her underworld, underland, under the ground, dark with no sun, is all the reality there is. And it's Poglum, I think, who says, well, even if that's true, it would still be better to believe in Narnia. So even if Narnia wasn't true, there's something noble about believing in it. Better than just believing there's nothing but the prison walls that you're telling me there is. So just after that, I'm going to finish with Chesterton, appropriately enough. I felt in my bones first that this world does not explain itself. I came to feel as if magic must have a meaning, and meaning must have someone to mean it. There was something personal in the world, as in a work of art. I thought this purpose beautiful in its old design, in spite of its defects, such as dragons. The proper form of thanks to it is some form of humility and restraint. We should thank God for beer and burgundy, but not drinking too much of them. I'm going to finish by getting the last word. We should indeed thank God for beer and burgundy, but not drinking too much of them. We should also thank God by drinking them. Thank you.